Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here, and today I want to talk about something that I think is really important, especially if you are new to the game or to PvP in general, and that is learning from other players. For example, I am not that great on Sniper, as you might know if you have seen me play it on stream, but I know some really good Sniper players. So, for example, I talk to Balls for my Sniper guide, or I drop by people's stream and I ask them what build they're running. Because even though I started playing this game at launch and I have played all the classes, learning from other players is something that I do all the time to improve. But I also know that especially if you're new to the game, you might not know as many players as I do. So that's where the idea for this video came from. Because a while ago, as I was trying to brush up on my knowledge of Sniper, Wuz agreed to do a coaching with me. And if you follow this channel for a while, you might have seen his name pop up already on 1 or 2 videos. And in my opinion, he is one of the best snipers on Daf Malgus. If he is on your team, then he's one of the few guys who will be really hard to beat in top DPS. And if he's on the enemy team, then he will just kite you forever and in general just make your life very difficult. So he was nice enough to jump on our Discord and spend almost 1 hour with me answering all my questions that I had about the class, giving me his take on it, strengths and weaknesses, and also some tips and tricks that I hadn't heard of before. So I wanted to share my notes, which I took during this coaching, and the knowledge that I got out of it with you. If this video is too long for you, just check the chapters in the description below. There are timestamps so you can forward to the parts that interest you. And if you like this kind of format and you want to see more in-depth coaching from some of the best players in this game, leave a like on the video and let me know in the comments below what you want to see next. So without further ado, the first thing that Wuz and me talked about were just kind of the strengths and weaknesses of the Sniper in general and its place in the meta. And I mean, this is to no surprise if you have seen my recent tier lists and also my engineering guide. But as far as strengths are concerned, Wuz was saying that basically one of the strengths of the class is actually its mobility. So the fact that it can really kite and run away from almost anything, which is of course a little bit counterintuitive for a class that's designed as a turret class, so as a static range DPS kind of caster class. But nevertheless, it's in the game right now. As of patch 7.3, it is one of the most mobile classes in the game. On the side of weaknesses, he was saying, yeah, of course, survivability is a challenge. It's not the best. It lacks damage reduction compared to something like a Madness Sorcerer or a Lethality Operative, which makes snipers still pretty squishy. He also mentioned the lack of self-heal compared to earlier expansions. And now I have to say this coaching took place before patch 7.3, so the Vital Regulators was not in the game yet. So as of patch 7.3, the self-heal is a little better. You can spec into that talent now. But nevertheless, that is still only, let's say, a 3% HP self-heal. It's not like a big heal on demand as you have on some other classes in the game. So overall, the lack of DR and self-heal is still something that's a weakness for the Sniper class. And finally, we talked about how he sees Sniper in the meta. And he said, well, first of all, he doesn't see a lot of people playing it. It is not really one of the meta classes. And I think that has changed a little bit. Now in patch 7.3, you definitely see more snipers. Maybe because people are trying out the buffs. Or because it's actually quite decent into something like a Madness Sorc now that it has a self-heal talent. But yeah, he says overall he sees snipers still on the weaker side because they, well, first of all, as we already said, lack the survivability, but then also in patch 7.0, a lot of their CC options were removed or put into the tree where it's really hard to take them, whereas other classes such as Sorcerers, for example, still have their hardstun baseline. Next, we talked about the different sniper specs and which one he thinks is best. And in his opinion, he said engineering currently is the best sniper class. But especially if you're playing arenas, then take a look at engineering. Especially if you're playing versus a lot of melee opponents, and engineering really has an advantage. And that's because of Plasma Probe mainly. But of course, in Arena also, it simply has the best burst out of all classes. So that's why Engineering overall he rates as the best spec. However, he personally, and if you have played versus him, you will know that he prefers Virulence, which he currently rates as the second best sniper spec in the game. And in particular, he says Virulence is better against ranged opponents. He prefers it because he mostly queues solo, and it has a little bit more survivability compared to Engineering. For those of you that don't know, Virulence gets 15% damage reduction after using a shield probe. That's a passive you get in the Virulence tree. So Virulence is a little bit more tanky, and since he is mostly a solo player, he prefers Virulence. Finally, we talked about Marksmanship, and there his takeaway was that, yeah, basically the spec unfortunately just kind of sucks because it simply doesn't do enough damage to make up for its rather poor survivability. So it really is a glass cannon, but without the cannon, it's just kind of just glass. Next, we jumped into the individual specs, and he gave me some tips on all of them, starting with the overall best Engineering. And that's something that I kind of forgot about. And I'm also not sure whether I mentioned it in the Engineering guide, but your covered escape, so the roll on Engineering, actually roots your targets if you roll through them or drop some bombs, and if your opponent walks over them, it roots them. So that's something that I will definitely try to use more in the future, and something that I didn't even think about. So that was an interesting takeaway for me. Then my next question to him was, Engineering, of course, is great at bursting, but what do you do in between? And his answer to that was simply focus on spamming your AoE, making sure you reposition your plasma probe as good as you can. Maybe if there's a big stack, then cast Orbital Strike into it and even use Suppressive Fire. However, you cannot really spam Suppressive Fire as much as you can on Marksman, for example. And keep in mind that your single target rotation also does some AoE as well on EMP Discharge, for example. But yeah, in between burst, focus on your AoE. That being said, he also stressed that energy management is really important on Engineering, whereas Virulence, which we're going to talk about in a second, doesn't really need to care about that. On NG, it is rather important that you take care of your energy management. So once you're done with the burst and all of your big attacks are on cooldown, you spam some AoE, but now you're running into a territory where your energy is kind of low, you're about to hit that breakpoint, then don't be afraid to sometimes use an auto attack, or I think it's called rifle shot, and use that time to reposition. Maybe use the auto attack while you're on the move and trying to get to a better cover position, and then go back into casting your big energy consuming abilities. Finally, he gave me a tip on the build for Engineering, and he said, try out the target acquired utility, because not only does it give you a nice buff if someone pops a defensive, it buffs your accuracy and gives you a nice armor penetration debuff, but most importantly, it makes it so that your targeting systems, so your auto crit buff in Engineering, gets 2 stacks, which is quite nice. So that's something I definitely want to try out in the future. Next, we talked about Virulence, his main spec, and I kind of asked him how he plays it, what's good about it. And he says, basically, whenever you have viral targeting, so your auto crit buff and your cull, then you are pretty powerful. And of course, the build that he recommends for Virulence is the Ultraviolet Blast build. So that's the tactical that you're running that finishes your dots and actually gives you some quite nice burst. So his tip for playing Virulence was really focus on lining up your viral targeting with your Ultraviolet Burst and your cull. That's when you're powerful. Otherwise, your damage is pretty meh. And especially when it comes to also the gearing, be careful not to waste your burst. You need to consider that for the Ultraviolet Blast tactical, your dot finisher is, of course, Weakening Blast, which is a weapon attack, so white damage, which means you can miss it a lot, especially if you're playing against a lot of sorcerers who have 10% defense chance. So for that reason, and also for the reason that Virulence does not have as many critical bonuses as Engineering, for example, he recommends running 105% accuracy. Also, he mentioned that he feels like high alacrity is still the way that Virulence is supposed to be played, but because of the overall low stat budget that we have in this expansion, it's not really worth it to run 1.3 GCD of alacrity or something. So he runs with 105% accuracy, the 1.4 GCD for alacrity, which is around 2200. and then puts the rest into crit. Regarding the playstyle, he's just basically saying that once you're done with your burst combo, which is of course the dots, viral targeting, and then pop your weakening blast into Cull, afterwards just focus on getting your dots on as many people as possible. And then also prioritizing series of shots over lethal shot, which I found interesting. That's not really something that I thought about. So in order to maximize your DPS, just focus on getting your burst windows off, and then afterwards just run around like a madman, dot everyone, and roll out again if you get focused. Finally, he gave me a tip on how he gets his dots on as many people as possible on Virulence, and that is to use Corrosive Dart on one of them, and then spam Corrosive Grenade over and over on this one person, making sure that you choose someone like a tank, or maybe a healer, that will most likely run to the middle of his own team, thereby kind of acting like a super spreader and spreading your Corrosive Dart on as many people as possible. Then lastly, as I went through my notes, I realized we didn't even talk about Marksmanship, which I guess tells you everything there's to know about the spec at the moment. Next up, I asked him for some tips about how he uses his defensives, and his first tip here was to pop Entrench early. So as soon as you're somewhat close to the action, just pop Entrench. And that is to avoid random stuns, but also to make use of the 60% AoE damage reduction that you get from it. So don't wait until you get stunned and then break and then pop Entrench. Just pop Entrench early to don't even give the enemies an opportunity to stun you. Because if you do get stunned, that was his point, you are paper. You have nothing you can really use in a stun. Only thing you can do is immediately hololocate. Next up, he mentioned that Ballistic Dampers, so the talent that you can take in the tree and reset it every 6 seconds, which gives you 30% absorb, is really powerful. And if you have it up, then you can even sometimes tank an energy burst or something like this. Maybe if you have your Adrenal ready as well, or you're playing Virulence and you have the 15% DR, you can even tank a PowerTech for a few seconds before you need to start to kite. But you need to watch your buffs and make sure that you don't think you have them up, but then, get one shot. Next, we talked a little bit about how Wuz varies his build in different kinds of situations. Now, most of the talents he takes, particularly on engineering, are the same ones that I already talked about in my guide. So if you haven't checked out the engineering guide, check that one out as well. But then he talked about some variations. For example, sometimes instead of hololocate, which is of course a very powerful escape tool, he runs Ballistic Shield. In particular, when he plays in a Premade and he feels like he has some support from a tank or a healer, and you don't need to use this oh shit button, which hololocate is, but you can stand and fight a little bit more, then Ballistic Shield is really nice, of course, also for the group utility. So particularly when you're playing in a group and you know that you may be playing with players that are not gonna run out of your diversion, they're not gonna run out of the Ballistic Shield zone, then you can use that a lot more. And might be a good option to take over hololocate. For arenas in particular, if there are tanks and healers queuing, he sometimes runs a big shield probe, which is the level 73 talent that you can pick, which also gives you the reduced cooldown on your meticulous preparation if you get hit. So that can also be a good idea to run, because particularly if you're in an arena with a tank and a healer, you first of all don't need to kite as much because you do have the support from the tank and healer. You should have guard. So instead of running, which is the main playstyle of the sniper, you are gonna stay in guard range, you are gonna stay in the fight. Maybe you're also running the Ballistic Shield. So that pairs up well with the big shield probe talent that you can run. Whereas if you're playing solo, maybe not as much. You really need to go for seek cover and play more of a hit and run playstyle. Next, we actually met in a couple of Warzones. So we kind of talked about how you want to approach dueling other snipers, or in general fighting against other snipers. And the thing here is that if the other sniper is good and knows the class, then you have to keep in mind that they know what you want to do, right? They know that if you're playing engineering and they see an explosive probe on their buff frame, they're looking for that and they're going to pop a defensive. So make sure to not waste your burst on something like that, but instead it is very important to kind of play these kind of mind games, right? So I put my explosive probe on you, so I can expect that you expect from me to detonate it with EMP discharge in the next global cooldown. So if I know that I'm playing versus a good sniper, I will not immediately detonate my explosive probe, but I will wait for them to use their defensive, wait it out, and then afterwards use my full burst once the defensive is down. So you can wait for their roll, for example. Finally, another big thing in sniper versus sniper duels is to try to avoid diversion, because diversion pulls you out of cover. If you're not in cover, you don't have entrench, and you're very vulnerable. You can get opened by assassins, for example. So what you want to do when fighting other snipers is try to roll diversion if at all possible, if you can see it coming. But make sure to save your evasion, because that's the only really useful defensive cooldown you can use if you get diversioned. So in case you fail the roll, make sure you have evasion up to run out of it with a movement speed buff. Next, I asked him for some general tips on positioning and kiting, and there's a couple of them, but really the first point was, if you're playing sniper, just imagine that you're paper. So if you take damage from anyone, you're in trouble. Knowing that, you want to adopt a certain playstyle where basically if you get hit, you start kiting away, and if multiple people chase you, you just keep running, you use your superior escape tools, and make people give up chasing you. So for positioning yourselves in a Warzone, that means just playing very conservatively, use your 35-meter range, and also watch where your team is. So try not to be isolated, because that's where you're weak. Finally, I asked him whether he thinks it's better to stay out in the open to get like some easy knockbacks and avoid to knock people into pillars, for example. But he actually says, no, it is better to stay close to line of sight objects. So for example, a box, or let's say a pillar in Void Star, because you need to use those in order to LOS other ranged players, for example, a couple of sorcerers opening on you. And if a melee chases you around the pillar, what you do is you leg shot them first, and then you walk up next to them and use cover pulls to knock them away from an angle. So that way you can avoid melees who position themselves smartly next to a wall, so your knockback would be useless. Of course, you can also use this trick in Void Star to root people on the bridge, roll up next to them, and knock them down. And then finally, we just talked about all the rest. I asked him, in his opinion, what is, for example, the best map for sniper. And he said, hands down, it is Hypergate, because Hypergate, you have a lot of open space next to the pylons, where as a sniper, you can really use your movement speed, and you can put your hololocate in very good places, behind one of those pillars, for example. So Hypergate is the map that he prefers to play on as a sniper. And then finally, we talked about the hardest class to face as a sniper. And he says, yeah, if you see PowerTech running at you, particularly Advanced Prototype, of course, which is the most popular spec, then it's just panic mode. So particularly if the PowerTech has hydraulics, you're really screwed. There's not much you can do. Even your evasion, which is currently bugged and doesn't fully protect you. So if you see a PowerTech, just run as fast as you can. That is your only defense. And at the same time, I asked him what are the best classes to pair with Sniper. So if you're a Sniper and you want to play with a friend or a Premade, maybe your friend makes a new character and you're figuring out what to play for PvP, then was mentioned that the best classes to pair a Sniper with would be a Juggernaut or a PowerTech, or even any other melee that can frontline for you. So something that can tank for you and take the damage in the middle of the fight, so that as a sniper, you can stay in the back, you can free cast, and you can do maximum damage. And that is it for today, guys. That is the short summary of my coaching with Wuz. Again, big thanks to my coach for agreeing to do this. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, because I really think talking to other players is the best way to get better at PvP. Queuing together and then improving together is really great and can also be fun. I know that a lot of people like to shit on premates, but I actually think it's good to build a premate, because playing PvP together, particularly against another premate, is just the most fun you can have, and it's also the best way to get better. And of course, if you are looking for other players to play with, why don't you join our guild on Duff Marker's Imp site? We started this one a while ago. It's a community guild, so it's open to everyone. Anyone can join. The guild is called Frog Dog Farmers, and if you're interested, just click on my Discord, link is in the description below, and you can ask anyone on there for an invite to the guild. That's it for today, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.